The beautiful place where Jesus often met with his disciples, spent that critical final time with them before his arrest, and where he will make a profound visit even in the future. This week we travel to the Mount of Olives. Welcome to the Shalom Y'all Ministries podcast. I am your co-host, Adam Keim, along with my good friend, Dr. Daniel McCabe. Daniel, how are you today?
Well, I'm good. I'm looking forward to the onset of spring. I thought it'd be here by now in northern Alabama, but I think the weather's supposed to be cold like one last time tonight, and then maybe we'll get back up into some steady, good spring weather, which I so enjoy. I can get out more and just hang around the yard and play with my dog and my kids. So, but today is still nonetheless an exciting time as summer and spring, I guess spring and summer come rushing towards me. I'm looking forward to it.
Well, good. I was going to ask you if spring had sprung over there in Alabama. It is springing here in North Texas. The ministry mission of Shalom Y'all is to teach and encourage those who love the Bible, the land of the Bible, and the people of the land. In addition to the teaching ministry, we also lead educational tours to the country of Israel. So you too can experience the land personally if you are able to join us someday. Go ahead and reach out to us for more information on how your group can experience the land of Israel firsthand. So we begin each episode of the podcast, as many of our faithful listeners may know by now. We start by featuring a random topic that can be about anything related to Israel or biblical theology in some way, or really anything that we think and hope that you will find interesting. So Daniel, what do you have to lead off for us today?
While sitting around the living room recently with my family, a question came up, Adam, from 2 Kings 2 about Elisha and his bald head. So, Adam, do you remember the passage where Elisha is mocked just outside Bethel by dozens of youth, as the New King James puts it, which the Bible says that they called out to him, "Go up, you bald head." Do you remember that story? And do you remember what happened next?
I do remember it, and I've been asked this question several times because a lot of people just assume it's Elisha and even God just picking on a bunch of innocent little kids. That's not what's going on. But yeah, a bear comes and takes care of them.
Yeah, actually, it says 2 female bears come out of the woods and maul them, and they just do they do a great number there on the folks there. I don't know that it mentions that they actually killed them, but they do maul them. So how do we make sense of it, Adam? I mean, how do you put that together? What's going on here? Do you know?
Well, I know it's more than just little kids teasing Elisha just for his bald head. I think it has something to basically the big. I'm assuming you're probably going to give us a good answer here, but generally, what's going on is they're more than just kids. They're probably young adults, and they're criticizing a role that he has. He's the prophet of God, and they are casting aspersion to that. So they are kind of actually criticizing the plan of God, so to speak.
Yeah, that's what I would say too. They were probably or potentially involved with the golden calf worship that was there at Bethel too. So these are not innocent little kids. Well, some have suggested that Elisha was in fact a bald man. That's why they say go up bald head. And that the young men who mocked him in the story were simply making fun of him for being bald. And if that's the case, it's kind of tragic that, you just call out bears from the woods to just maul children for just making fun of you. I don't think that's what it is at all. Others have suggested that Elisha had a tonsure cut. Now, I actually just learned what that word means. That's when you shave only the top of your head and you leave a ring of hair under and around the bald spot, like you sometimes see with Buddhist monks or medieval Catholic monks.
Like Friar Tuck.
Yes, exactly. And that Elisha shaved his head in that way to mark himself as a prophet. Now, so then the youth were definitely mocking Elisha's role, as you said, as a prophet. And perhaps we're saying something along the lines of, we don't want your kind around here. We've heard that Elijah supposedly ascended up into heaven. Why don't you just follow him on up there so that we can be rid of you as well? something along those lines. But there may be one more possible explanation for Elisha's bald head, and that's that Elisha shaved his head as a sign of grief over the loss of his master Elijah. The practice of shaving one's head is mentioned several times by prophets like Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Amos, and Micah, and it was a practice associated with grief. For example, in the book of Micah, the people, they're grieving the invasion and destruction of their land by the Assyrians, whom God sent as a judgment upon Israel for her idolatry and wicked lifestyle. Speaking to the Israelites, Micah writes in chapter 1, verse 18, he says, "Shave yourselves bald and cut off your hair in sorrow for your precious children. Make yourselves as bald as an eagle, for they have been taken from you into exile." Other translations read here, rather than as bald as an eagle, they'll read as bald as a vulture, perhaps referencing the griffin vulture so common to Israel. In any event, I'm not suggesting that you should shave your head, Adam, or anybody after the loss of a good friend or a family member, as seems possible in this account here of Elisha in 2 Kings. And I'm not suggesting that you should shave it when tragedy strikes, as we see in Micah 1. Every culture has its own way of grieving, and so we can all keep our hair. But I guess in bringing this up, I just wanted to say that grief is so very real, and we shouldn't stuff it. Others may mock you while you grieve, as they did perhaps here with Elisha. Or perhaps I've even brought trouble upon myself, like the Israelites in Micah 1. But let your grief move you back to the comforting arms of the Lord, no matter what the circumstances. And once again, you'll be able to rise above your grief with wings like eagles, as it says in Isaiah 40:31. Trust him to do that in your life, and he will.
Well, Daniel, my random topic of the day has a connection to the main topic, the Mount of Olives, which is perhaps the most famous hill in Jerusalem. But it is surrounded by other notable ones as well. The city and the surrounding area has a lot of hills, each with a history of all their own. So, for example, there's the Western Hill, which is in the southwestern portion of the old city where Herod built his palace. And there's Mount Zion in the city proper. That's where the temple was built. Now, today, if you go to Jerusalem and tell a cab driver to take me to Mount Zion, they'll take you to the Western Hill, which they call Zion.
Oh, that's for sure.
Because that's the highest point, so they figure that's where. But the actual Mount Zion, where the temple is built, that was also Mount Moriah from Abraham's day, where he was about to sacrifice Isaac, and which later King David purchased for the site of the temple. But I'd like to focus on the hills next to the Mount of Olives. Just to the north is Scopus. You may have heard of that one. It was called that because the Romans could get a great strategic view or scope of Jerusalem from that hill. They camped there whenever they would come against the city, such as Pompey did in 63 BC when Rome first captured Jerusalem, and later Titus in AD 70, of course, against the famous siege of Jerusalem there. The Crusaders also used Scopus for that purpose in the 11th century, and even General Allenby against the Ottomans in 1917. This hill also might be Nob. Remember that? Where King Saul had 85 priests killed while chasing David. Doeg killed them. It might be, but the site of Nob is difficult to discern. But some people call Mount Scopus also the Hill of Nob. Today, the Hebrew University campus, and there's a hospital, sits on that Mount Scopus today.
Adam, I got to tell you, I never even thought about that. I never even considered why it was called Mount Scopus. That's a beautiful explanation. Now I know.
Yeah, you get a good scope of the city, and it's been used for that purpose many times throughout history. Yep. Now, that's just to the north of Mount of Olives. Just to the south is one called the Hill of Offense, or Mount of Corruption. Now, this is where Solomon built high places to foreign gods. So if you find yourself on the Mount of Olives and you're overlooking the Temple Mount across the Kidron Valley, look to your left, and that hillside over there is where Solomon built all those high places. We read in 1 Kings 11, verses 6 through 8, So Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and did not wholly follow the Lord as David, his father, had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, and for Molech, the abomination of the Ammonites, on the mountain east of Jerusalem. And so he did for all his foreign wives. He had many, who made offerings and sacrificed to their gods. Now, the peak of the hill of offense is higher in elevation than God's temple itself. And in the ancient world, that spoke volumes to the priority of the foreign gods that Solomon put on public display. And that was probably a political move mostly, but one that God did not take kindly to say the least. The final hill I'd like to point out is just to the south of the old city, across the Hinnom Valley. It's called the Hill of Evil Counsel. It's named that because that's where Judas conspired with members of the Sanhedrin to betray and capture Jesus. Now, funny enough, today on the Hill of Evil Counsel is a United Nations headquarters. I will leave it up to our listeners to make any jokes that they want to about that. Daniel?
I'll just leave it at that.
Okay. Probably wise.
Yes.
What is this week's trivia question?
Okay, I think I have a good one. So, Adam, do you have a favorite color? I like dark green, but what do you like?
I do. I like dark green, but silver and teal are my two favorite colors.
Silver and teal. All right. Well, my high school colors were green and white. I went to Longview High School in Longview, Texas. Go Lobos. So today's trivia question is obviously going to be about colors. I'll list for you and our listeners the 5 most often mentioned colors in the Bible, according to the New King James Version. And you tell me which is number 1, which is the most often mentioned color. Are you ready?
I could try my best.
Okay. All right. In alphabetical order, so I don't, again, influence anybody, we have these 5 colors: blue, green, purple, red, and white. Blue, green, purple, red, and white, which is the most often mentioned color in the Bible. One of those 5. And I'll give you bonus points if you can guess the top 3, even if you get them out of order. And maybe our listeners can do that. I'll have the answer for you later in the podcast.
Hills and valleys are a common metaphor for the ups and downs in life. The city of Jerusalem is built upon them both. Anywhere you walk, you are either ascending or descending, so you better bring some good shoes when you visit. One large hill is unmistakable with a rich history all its own, the Mount of Olives. Daniel, something that I really like about touring Israel is that you come upon places that are great to reflect not only about what God has done at that place in the past, but also what he will do there in the future. One such site is Megiddo. I enjoy looking out over the valley of Jezreel from the hill of Megiddo and seeing the landscape where the armies of Antichrist will gather before marching against Jerusalem. Now, our listeners are very savvy, so they probably already know that we get our word Armageddon from the Hebrew Har Megiddo. Har meaning mountain or hill, and Megiddo for the ancient city of Megiddo, one of the most strategic locations in the ancient world. But another location of future importance is, of course, the Mount of Olives. After Jesus' resurrection, his disciples asked him when the kingdom was to be inaugurated. But he responds with a job for them before that kingdom would come in the future. In Acts 1:8, he commissions them to be his witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and Stephenville, Texas, and Alabama, the uttermost parts of the earth.
Which was the uttermost part?
Stephenville. It's got to be Dublin, probably. In verses 9 through 12 of Acts 1, we read, "And when he had said these things, as they were looking on, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while they were gazing into heaven as he went, behold, two men stood by them in white robes and said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking into heaven? This Jesus, who was taken up from you into heaven, will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven. Then they returned to Jerusalem from the mount called Olivet, which is near Jerusalem, a Sabbath's day journey away. So Jesus ascended into heaven from the Mount of Olives, and he will come back the same way that he went, also the same place that he went. We learn this from Zechariah 14. When the armies of Antichrist do come against Jerusalem from the valley of Megiddo, Jesus will descend onto the Mount of Olives and destroy them. Zechariah 14, 3-4 says, Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. So as a result of the mountain splitting, we can infer that Jesus will have a smooth route into the temple through the east gate. And I think that an underground spring will be uncovered to provide a great water source for the millennial temple and also the Dead Sea, as we can read about in Ezekiel 47. And that's something that I've written about in a couple of our Facebook posts. Our listeners can visit Shalom Y'all Ministries on Facebook and like the page to stay updated on the various things that we discuss there. And they can subscribe to the weekly email that you send out, Daniel, by visiting our website at shalomyallministries.org.
Yeah, it comes out every Saturday at 1 o'clock.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff in there. I love the articles that you write. Just a good grab bag of different kinds of information that touch on different interests. So I highly recommend people subscribe to that weekly email. And if you ever find yourself in the Mount of Olives, as you look across the Kidron Valley, as I've mentioned before, and take in the sights of the Temple Mount and the city of Jerusalem, look up and see where Jesus ascended to heaven and from where he will return in glory to usher in the kingdom of justice and righteousness.
Well, Adam, let's take a walk if you're up for it today.
I got my walking shoes on.
Yep. Well, one of my favorite things to do in Israel is to take groups on a walk up the Mount of Olives. Almost no one does that. It's because it's a tough climb. But walking up the mountain really does help you experience what Jesus felt each time he walked this way. And he did it daily when he was staying in Jerusalem. He would walk between Jerusalem and Bethany while he stayed as a guest in the home of Lazarus. And he would come for the annual feasts of Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. And he'd go back and forth. And when you walk this regularly, you sense how it felt physically. Now, Jesus was clearly in much better shape than I am. So admittedly, I got to tell you, when I walk up the Mount of Olives, by the time I get to the top, I'm really, really out of breath. And my calves are burning long before I get there. And if I don't stop at least a couple of times along the way, I might completely give out. But I know we can do it. And so I want to take you on that walk. It'll take you about 20 minutes. Adam, have you ever walked up the Mount of Olives?
I have. A really neat walk to do is you go from the upper room airspace, the place where the upper room once was.
Gotcha.
And you walk from there to the Mount of Olives. Because Jesus, like going from the Last Supper to the Garden of Gethsemane. Yeah, you walk down into the Kidron Valley and then up, and then we would walk up to the Church of All Nations and the Grotto of Gethsemane there, and then continue on up the Mount of Olives. It's a good workout, but it's a really fun one.
It really is. I've done it before in the middle of the night where we've gotten up at like 3, 4 in the morning, got dressed, grabbed a granola bar or something, and then walked up the mountain to where at the top of the Mount of Olives, we can sit there and wait for the sun to rise. And that's fantastic. It's been a while since I've done that. I'd love to do that again sometime. Well, we're going to begin in the Garden of Gethsemane, which is at the foot of the Mount of Olives. Today there we see a beautifully maintained garden of olive trees that's adjoining a church. Inside that church, they house a stone that they say was the stone upon which Jesus prayed the night before his crucifixion. Of course, we can't know that. But the garden is beautiful. And although some of the trees in the garden are really large and look super old, most historians would suggest that they are only descendants. These trees are only descendants of the trees that populated the area in Jesus' day, as it's commonly supposed that the 4 Roman legions who besieged Jerusalem, you mentioned earlier 70 AD, well, that these men camped around the whole city entirely in a ring. They would have camped there and they would have cut all the trees for firewood. So in any event, as we stand here, even though these may not be the original trees, this is a great location to just stop and to pray and to remember and anticipate the suffering that Jesus would go through, and that he did that for us. So we begin at the Garden of Gethsemane, and now we're going to start heading up the steep, winding path towards the summit. We're going to head up on just a short walk. We won't go too far before we'll turn left into the churchyard of Dominus Flevit. That's Latin for the Lord wept. It's a tear-shaped church that marks the spot where many believe that Jesus wept over the city while descending the mountain during his triumphal entry. You can read about that in Luke 19. You'd think that he'd be joyful at a time like that as he's coming in, but he knew that the hosannas he was hearing from the people at that moment would soon turn into cries of "Crucify him!" and subsequently lead within 4 short decades to the fall of Jerusalem in judgment in 70 AD for the people's unbelief. And when we think of unbelief, particularly that of the leadership and the Pharisees whose eyes were blind to the truth about Jesus, at least most of them. And after enjoying the beautiful view of the city through an amazing window inside the church, and after, as I said, pausing to pray for the city and its people as Jesus did, we can head on back out and continue our climb. And we needed that breath. We needed to catch our breath there a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So keep heading up the steep, winding road, and now we've come to a massive Jewish cemetery on the right that holds upwards to 150,000 graves. Now, that's a lot.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, the cemetery is a coveted resting place for those who believe that the Messiah will return to the Mount of Olives, as he promised in Acts 1, 11, and 12. And there are some notable names buried there inside the seminary, including Eliezer ben Yehuda, who is the father of modern Hebrew. He's the one who reintroduced Hebrew to the Jewish people. And Menachem Begin, who's the 6th prime minister of Israel. He's buried there. Many of the graves today sadly show signs of neglect and vandalism, and some were badly damaged during the period of time between 1948 and 1967 when Jordan ruled over Jerusalem. But the cemetery is slowly being restored. You can step inside the seminary, and even there you can get some beautiful views of the city of Jerusalem, but mindful that these people wanted, many of them, perhaps all of them, wanted to be buried there to be close to the beloved city of Jerusalem. Leaving the cemetery now, we'll finish our climb to the summit, where by the time we get to the top, we'll find an overlook that affords unbelievable views of the city, because we're at the top now, and you can see the Dome of the Rock. That's the shrine that the Muslims built over the historic site of Solomon. You mentioned Mount Moriah and the sacrifice of Isaac. And of course, this is the place where the temple was built, both by Solomon, the first temple, and Herod's second temple. And then you can scan the wall of the old city closest to you, and you'll see the eastern wall with its famous closed gates, in which the Messiah will return one day, hopefully very soon. And you can glance off to your left, more down in the valley rather than to the area you were mentioning where Solomon had set up idols. But if you look more down in the valley, you can see the city of David off to the left. And this is the site of the ancient city of Jerusalem. And then if you look beyond the site of the old city and the Temple Mount, you can see the modern city of Jerusalem just blooming larger and larger every year. So with the wind whipping through our hair, and as we take some amazing photos, perhaps if we listen carefully, we can still hear the words of our teary-eyed Savior who said, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing." One day, Israel will again turn to the Lord in large numbers, according to Romans 11. But until that day, I just encourage you to follow through on the words of Psalm 122:6 that say, "Pray for the peace of Jerusalem." Okay, so earlier I asked the question, what is the most often mentioned color in the Bible according to the New King James Version? And here are the top 5 colors in alphabetical order. They are blue, green, purple, red, and white. So, Adam, you want to take a shot at this? Which is the most often mentioned color in the Bible?
Well, as I try to think, I'm narrowing it down between red and white. But I have a curveball to throw at. Does this
Okay.
count derivative words? Words like Adam and Edom are based on the word for red.
No, I'm
It's
just taking the straight
okay,
English words.
just the
Yes.
English word. I'm going to guess white.
The answer is white with
Oh, good.
75 occurrences. You did great. Okay, so now I promise bonus points if you could give me the top 3, even if you didn't have them in the
Oh
right
boy.
order. But so far, you're doing great. So, what are the top 3? And second and third are very, very close. They're only separated by 1,
Oh
but
wow.
they're well behind white. So, white was a runaway color. And what are number 2 and number 3?
Okay, well, I'm an American and a Texan. I'm gonna guess red, white, and blue. White being number 1, then
Uh
red, then
huh.
blue. That's my guess.
Okay, well, you got one of them.
Okay.
So we know again that white is number 1. Number 2 might surprise you. In the New King James Version, it's purple
Whoa. Okay.
at
Yeah.
53 occurrences,
Wow.
and it beats out number 3, red, with 52
Okay.
occurrences. Now, blue's right behind at 48, and green is a little distance back with 39 occurrences. But I was really surprised when I was playing around with this to see purple come out as number 2. But there we are: white, purple, red, then blue, and then green. By now, our listeners know that Shalom is an acronym that helps explain what our ministry is all about. And I've finally come to the very last letter. I haven't taken them up necessarily in this order, but the M, the last letter here, the M in Shalom stands for media and resources. So in the past, we've shared things like the best resources for Bible maps and then learning Hebrew. We've introduced you to great books like the Copper Scroll Project by my friend Shelley Neese and Chad Barrett's book on the birth of Jesus called While Watching Flocks by Night. So we hope you have found these many resources helpful, and there's many more coming. But we invite you to join us at Shalom Y'all Ministries on Facebook, where we post about them, media things and also other things as well. Let me give you the listing here again from the acronym SHALOM. S stands for scriptures. We do scripture studies of all kind. H is the history and geography of Israel. A is the archaeology of the Bible. L is the life in the land of Israel. O is for on the ground tours. And then finally, again, the M stands for media and resources. So shalom is the word peace or hello in Hebrew, and that's why we picked it. But in any event, if you don't do Facebook, simply send your email address to shalomyallministries@gmail.com. Shalomyallministries@gmail.com. No spaces, no apostrophes. And we'll send you everything we write in the email that we mentioned earlier that comes out every Saturday at 1 o'clock, which we call our weekly.
Thank you so much for joining us this week on the Shalom Y'all Ministries podcast. We do hope that you enjoyed this look at the Mount of Olives. There is so much to see there, and we hope you can find the opportunity to visit yourself, maybe with us someday. Shalom, y'all.
Shalom, y'all.